Welcome to the University of Maryland Robert H. Smith School of Business Energy Club podcast series. Our podcasts are designed to connect you, our listeners, to current issues in the industry and the employers targeting them. This podcast is part 2 of a multi-part series of interviews with Constellation Energy that we're airing in the spring of 2011. A Fortune 500 company, Constellation is a leading supplier of wholesale and retail energy products to electric and natural gas customers in the U.S. Constellation's fleet generates up to 12,000 megawatts of electricity, and the company saw revenues of over $14 billion in 2010. These interviews were conducted in the fall of 2010. Since our interviews, Constellation has made several acquisitions and continues to position itself as a leader in electricity generation and supply, as well as renewable energy solutions. For the most up-to-date information on the company, as well as employment opportunities, we encourage you to visit Constellation's website at www.constellation.com. Thanks for joining us, and now for our interview. I'm Kristen Thompson, and this week we resume our interview with Andrew Good, Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy and Development at Constellation. Given what we've learned about Constellation, where does your unit, Corporate Strategy and Development, fit into the business?
We work, so one of the primary missions we have is we work with the business units to figure out what is our long-term strategy going to be. So we call it Vision 2020 right now, and we kind of look 10 years forward. What do we want the company to look like, and what would success look like, and how do we balance the needs from a capital perspective and such for those segments, for new energy, the generation, and BGE. We also work with them. We work with not only the business units, but then the executive team and the board of directors to develop the overall strategy, figure out then how to push that strategy down into the business units. And then we try to figure out how we're going to achieve the strategy from the perspective of organic growth, where we're going to emphasize innovation, and maybe where we're going to decide that mergers and acquisitions investments can be required to kind of jump start certain aspects of the business strategy. And so we'll work closely not only developing that strategy, but then trying to figure out what the key performance metrics are, what the targets should be, and then the Corporate Strategy and Development Group has the responsibility for then reporting out how we're doing relative to those targets.
So to what extent is the strategy team working externally versus internally?
We work both internally and externally. So developing the strategy, you kind of bring together, so think of it more as a coordination role. So we're working with the business units on what their capabilities are. We're working with external entities to understand what's the environment we operate in, where do we see changes happening in the marketplace that we might be able to take advantage of or we have to be concerned about. And then when we think about partners, the partner decision tends to be more once we figure out what we think the strategy wants to be, or what we want the strategy to be, we will then decide whether it's appropriate for us to go out and find partners to help us move that forward, or whether this is something we can do internally, or maybe we have to just go out and buy the capability. So mergers and acquisitions work.
So to what extent are you developing innovations in-house versus seeking out mergers and acquisitions?
We are working very diligently, actually, on the innovation front. So what we have found, and this past year we've got someone now hired specifically to kind of be the innovation leader inside the company, and by that, what they're doing is they're looking across the company to see where we have the opportunity. And what we found is we were actually doing a lot of innovation. It was just kind of happening below the radar. And so what this person does is we now have much better communication across the units, and this person kind of coordinates that. But what we're trying to do is say, we're doing this stuff internally, so we're constantly figuring out better ways to operate power plants, new fuel types, or how do you, particularly as you think about new biofuels, how do we work with that in our power plants? What are better ways to lower emissions? When we think about with our customers, innovation might mean how do you think of products that better meet the customer's needs? So it's easy to say we want to do solar panels, but it's hard to sometimes get that to meet with how the customer thinks about their business model. And so we've been trying to be innovative on how can we provide that product in a way that the customer can say, okay, I'm willing to take the risk to do this for a 10-year or 20-year time period. And so innovation might take the form of product design there. And then we work externally. What we've done is we've started to make a couple private equity investments into firms where we look at the horizon primarily from a technology perspective, and we look to see what are the new technologies coming down the pipe that will affect either Constellation directly or will affect our customers. And then we try to decide if it's important that we should try to jump in and invest equity in those and try to partner with those smaller firms that are just being created. And then we can provide a strategic role for them by either being an output for their products, so we're a buyer, or maybe we can help marry them up with our customers and help them grow that way.
And these firms that you look at, are they strictly American, or do you look overseas as well?
We would look overseas as well. We are focused on U.S. Customers, so our customers primarily reside in the U.S. But if you think about that from a supply perspective, if there were international firms that had key technology that we could use in the U.S., we would certainly want to work with those firms.
Now, you touched on how some of the innovations Constellation is working on include renewable energy technologies. Can you expand on new opportunities in the industry and what you consider to be most exciting?
Sure. So if I think broadly of the energy industry, clean tech, the broader tech term now is clean tech, is clearly one of the most exciting areas and creates a lot of opportunities. And so if you think about those opportunities, it's how do you figure out how to build more emissions-free generation? And so it might be wind, it might be solar, it might be nuclear. And how do you do it in a cost-effective manner? And so today it requires a lot of government subsidies to get those technologies deployed. And if you look at wind and solar, they're great in that the fuels are free, but they're what's known as an intermittent resource. And so they kind of turn on and off depending on whether the wind blows or the sun shines. And it's hard to have a stable grid if you have too many resources that are intermittent like that. So how do you think about how to balance those with coal-fired plants or natural gas-fired plants, or maybe batteries? So how to use maybe storage or something to help balance the load. So a lot of money and effort going into figuring out it's loosely called renewables, but I would say nuclear is in that category as well. And then how do you make it so it's cost effective? Because I think ultimately, particularly in tough economic times like we find ourselves today, people are less willing to pay twice as much to get this kind of energy as maybe alternative generation sources would provide. It also, another big area on this is kind of the energy efficiency. So how do you reduce the actual demand for power? So how do you teach people, or how do you build better technologies? And this can be refrigerators. It can be how do you make it so we don't lose as much power shipping the power down the power lines. It can be demand response. And so by that, it's not having everybody do their laundry at 4 o'clock in the afternoon is a classic one, or maybe cycling air conditionings. And so if you can reduce the peak demands, you can save consumers a lot of money. You can reduce the amount of power plants that have to be built. And so that's really about convincing people to shift their energy demands out of kind of the key peak time of the day and maybe figuring out ways to spread their energy demand across the day. We've got some very large customers, commercial industrial customers, who are able to shift or change the shifts that people work so that they can have their heavy energy consumption happening at lower at points of the day where less power is being used on the grid. Those are very important because when you think of the cost-effective means to save money or save energy, it tends to be the energy efficiency and demand response tend to be the most cost-effective, and in fact are cost-effective today without government subsidies. And so we spend a lot of time working with our customers trying to move those forward. And if I can throw just a couple last points. The electric vehicles, they're finally there, right? So this next 10 years, these cars are right on the edge of becoming a mainstream consumer choice. And I'm thinking more of plug-in hybrids or electric vehicles, pure electric vehicles. And I think we'll see in the next 10 years, this will be a very dynamic aspect of the power industry as we figure out how to make the grid work with them. It's going to be a big demand on the grid, and so we've got to beef up the grid a bit. But how to convince people, again, to charge up off-peak, so not when everybody else is trying to use power, and so we can make it cost-effective. And there's going to and this will have energy security implications because it'll reduce the oil demand into the country. So very, very exciting, probably next decade with respect to electric vehicles. And then I'd say in the last front, natural gas, and I don't know how much your listeners follow kind of these shale gas plays, but the new finds and the changes in technology that allow us to extract natural gas from shale formations in the country have led to the realization that we have tremendous natural gas reserves in the U.S. And that's great for the consumer because that's going to mean lower power prices, but it'll mean a variety of things for the energy industry as coal becomes less advantaged. So now coal is more expensive relative than gas, so it's less economic, and that'll cause some owners of coal-fired power plants to consider maybe shutting down their plants. And then you've got the EPA coming along with additional regulations, tighter regulations around the emissions from coal plants. I think you could see this kind of change up in the fundamental mix of of the U.S. generation fleet, but in a large way led by these incredibly large natural gas reserves that we're finding.
And that concludes this week's segment of our interview. Join us next week when we wrap up our interview with Andrew Good and learn more about policy implications on Constellation strategy, as well as career opportunities for MBAs at the company.